Okay, Rachel, welcome back to the podcast. I'm very, very excited to have you back on the channel. For those of you who don't remember, you actually did a recovery story with us a couple of years ago, and yeah, I'm delighted to have you back.
Pleased to be here. Great to see you again, Harry.
It's been a while. It's been a while, but yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff to go over, and I'm excited to hear about your marathons and everything you've been up to over the last couple of years. But maybe for our listeners, maybe we can take us back to the beginning of your kind of long COVID journey, as you will. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your initial experience with that and
Yep.
how that kind of all came about.
Yeah, I mean, it's now. So this was December 2020 is when I got COVID. So right in the middle of, I think, lockdown two, probably, and nearly 3 years ago. So I've told my story quite a lot over that time. Every time I tell it, I get just a bit clearer in terms of what was actually happening and kind of end up being able to kind of maybe take more of an observer's view. So yeah. Um, I think in order to understand my long COVID journey, you sort of have to go back to before COVID.
Yeah.
And I think everyone says this, don't they? So for me, what that looked like was that I freelanced as a trainer. My second home was basically London. I was there most weeks, a lot of travel, some international travel, also trying to single parents, and just very busy. And I think mentally very busy. I was constantly striving to think about how do I look after my daughter at the same time as delivering a workshop? And what if I get bad feedback? And will that mean people won't want to work with me? And where's my next work coming from? And even just saying that, do you know what I mean? I never switched off,
Hmm.
never switched off. And I now wonder whether that was what we would call anxiety, but it didn't feel like anxiety because it didn't stop me. But I was always pre planning and pre thinking and worrying about what was happening next rather than enjoying maybe the present. So I will say that. So I got COVID in 2020, which is obviously in the middle of a pandemic. And it was a weird time. Like at the time, I thought I was coping quite well, but it was so surreal, wasn't it? So
Hmm.
surreal watching the news, watching the death counts go up, listening as to will I have work, will I not have work, will I be on Zoom, will I actually be going back to London? All of these things kind of going on in the background, waiting for Boris to make his announcement, being late, etc. So that
It
was
was
happening.
dystopian, wasn't it? It was dystopian.
Yeah. And do you know what? At the time, I would have said that I didn't feel fear, but that just sounds ridiculous objectively 3 years later. I think it was so dystopian that all of those emotions kind of get repressed. So yeah, just a weird time, wasn't it? I remember going and getting my daughter tested. So she was with her dad. He texted me to say he had COVID. She then had a temperature and funny taste. I drove to Bristol Airport to get her tested. It was dystopian. We weren't
Hmm.
allowed to open the window beyond kind of that much just to put the test through.
Yeah, yeah.
People in suits, where you normally go on holiday, was completely closed off. And it was like this nuclear kind of testing station. Um, so she had COVID, and then I remember delivering a workshop on Zoom with her upstairs, a pre-planned workshop, and just having this very physical derealization,
Hmm.
and carrying on the workshop, but not really feeling like myself, and then finishing, and then realizing that I had COVID. Um, we isolated. I cancelled my work. I think we isolated. I was that parent. I was so worried about this that I would be the parent, and I was the parent that meant that the whole class got isolated just before Christmas. We're in a WhatsApp group. I was getting message upon message upon message from people saying that they'd also caught COVID. And just looking back, the shame and the guilt that I felt about the fact that I'd been the person that had let this virus into our class. I had people that were messaging me saying that their husband was in hospital. My daughter's dad had the paramedics out. Um, so looking back, I felt like I was taking it in my strides.
Mm.
Um, but I now looking back wonder whether actually there was more fear associated than I maybe thought. But it was quite mild. It was over Christmas. We got out on the 22nd of December. I didn't have any of the main symptoms that they were talking about, just fatigue, brain fog, this kind of derealization, bit of a sore shoulder maybe.
When you say derealization, can you put
Yeah,
into word
it was,
what do you mean by that?
well, I think that's what I've called it. It's subjective, isn't it? So
Mm,
I'd felt this before once in a scuba diving accident. And at the time, I thought it was neurological. I now think it actually is just a pure fear based, almost freeze kind of response. Just like I was not in my own body.
hmm
Just physical. I now see it as physical fear, to be honest. But at the time, I thought it was something. Well, I thought it was some kind of nerves. um, which actually it is your nervous system, isn't it?
hmm
So I don't know. I just didn't feel like me. I felt like I was playing a part, but I wasn't in my own body. um,
I think that's very common. I think that's
yeah,
this kind of depersonalization where you I, I've kind of described it almost like being in a bubble in many
yeah,
ways. It's kind of like you're there, you're present,
yeah.
you're in the moment,
You're not
but you're
really
not
there.
really
You're just
there.
kind of,
You're kind of almost observing yourself
yeah,
from
yeah,
a different
exactly.
viewpoint, and you're kind of watching things go, but you're not involved in that
Yeah, exactly
in that
that.
actual
And so I
moment.
ran this workshop in exactly that state, and I've done it so many times. I was able to play a role, but I
Yeah.
felt like I was an actor playing a role rather than me being me. It's almost like there's a split between you, your mind, and your body. They don't feel like they're one and the same somehow.
hmm
Um, yeah, so I mean, I had an interview with Nicole Sachs, who I follow, who is a therapist that works in the fields of chronic pain, and she said, actually, Rachel, that's quite a common symptom of having a severe panic attack. But
hmm
obviously, I didn't see that at the time. That was the point where I knew I had COVID. Um, in my head.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I got back to life really. I came out, it was 22nd of December, it was Christmas time. I went back to running, I went back to drinking, I went back to just everything you would normally
Living it
do.
up.
I lived it up a bit, not that much. I went back to work. Everything was kind of cool. I was sleeping a bit longer, maybe. Um, and I was kind of looking out for um, whether I had signs of breathlessness. Um, I think because I was so confused as to why I hadn't really during the time that I got COVID. And then I remember it, the 5th of January. Well, no, the 2nd of January I had really bad brain fog because it lasted all day. The 3rd of January, I just felt really tired. The 5th of January, I was on a client call and I had that same derealization again where I just felt like I couldn't function. I wasn't really there. I couldn't really engage. I don't know if they noticed or not, but that's what it felt like to me. And then the 6th, I was running a workshop and I just felt hideous. And I ran the workshop, dived into bed for a few hours, tried to work out how on earth I was going to pick up my daughter. Um, Somehow managed it, ran another workshop, and then just dived into bed for days.
Mm.
And then I got better and it was all right. And I went back to running, did a couple of bike rides, did some work, had a really good week. And then it came back again, and it came back where it was pins and needles, um, kind of a burning throat, um, the same derealization again that was always present,
hmm
and was always the kind of start of the kind of bust piece. Yeah, and then I had 2 months really where it was kind of okay for a bit, not okay, okay, not okay, and then I call it mid-February, just bust. I
Mm.
slept for an entire weekend where I just couldn't function, and then that was the start of the insomnia. I don't think I slept for more than a couple of hours for months. Um, Yeah.
It's strange how it kind of creeps up as well. And you hear this. There's a couple of points that I wanted to pick up on there, because
Mm,
I think one of the big things is that very often it seems that these kind of illnesses are happening to people who are very much kind of go-getters,
yeah.
constantly busy with their life, high achievers. That seems a very kind of common thread. And also it's quite interesting how, certain cases there will be a kind of trigger event. So whether it be
Yeah.
you go for a run, or doing something high impact, high stress, and then that kind of tips you over the edge. But
Yeah.
also quite often it seems to be a graduated decline. I know
Yeah.
with myself, for example, I had COVID initially. I was kind of fine, recovered, and then it was later on that it kind of really happened. And I think that's the case with you, and you hear it with a lot of people. Same with MECFS. Quite often, it starts off as kind of being able to push through and muster through the day, and then it gets to a point where you just have this crash, and it's this
Yeah.
boom, this bust, and you just end up in this kind of perpetual state of fatigue, right?
Yeah. I now don't know that it was anything to do with me exercising. I've thought a lot about this and I've looked at a lot of stories and I've looked at a lot of people that have had ME. I don't know that it was the exercise.
No.
I think that it's just that a lot of people that are always on, really busy, a lot of people do exercise and it's a really easy thing to blame. But when I stopped exercising, I actually still continued to decline.
Mm.
At the time I thought that I'd literally ruined my life. I'd done it to myself. When I now unpick, I realised that the first time I went for a run, my mum actually said to me, "Be careful, you might get post-viral fatigue. This is a really dangerous illness." My partner of the time also told me a story of someone that had recovered and had then woken up a few days later and was sick again. And so he told me about the fact that this was a relapsing illness. I'd read in the newspapers that you weren't supposed to exercise. So I do wonder whether I kind of put two and two together, and it's a very because it's such a scary thing. I mean, it's definitely very physical. I had purple toes. Do you know what I mean? Like you can't argue with that. You can see them, um, but I'm not convinced. I just think that once you decide that it's a thing, because you're just looking for clues as to why this is happening, and the easy things are virus and exercise. And then to attach those two things. And I think that's what makes it maybe harder to recover, is because you become convinced that it's those two things. Um, I now wonder whether my long COVID was anything to do with COVID or whether it was the fear of having had COVID. I don't know. And it probably doesn't matter in terms of recovery.
Mm.
um, because you start to get into these cycles. But I also don't know whether it was anything to do with exercise, because not everyone that got long COVID was exercising. I
No.
wonder now whether that was an association that I was really quick to pick up on, through talking to people and some of my own worries and looking at the NHS websites and being in groups. Um,
I think
so
there's.
yeah,
I think it seems though that there is some kind of sort of trigger that seems to kind of set off this cascade though that comes out of. Um, I think it's very common that people seem to be in some kind of, their certainly nervous system seems to be totally out
yeah,
of kilter at
yeah,
that time, whether that be
yeah,
from the overwhelming stress, emotional states. I mean, MECFS can be set off by chronic stress and burnout as well.
yeah,
So it seems like in a lot of these cases, there's some kind of offset where things are out of kilter, and then
yeah,
there's some kind of trigger, whether that be the virus or exercise, or maybe not exercise. Maybe in other cases it will be
yeah,
an emotional thing, or maybe it will be something a
yeah,
little bit different. And I
yeah,
think it seems fairly unique, because and I think that also maybe has a contribution to how the condition is so heterogeneous, because certain people will have tons of brain issues and feel really neurological. Others won't have any of that at all and just feel kind of more in their body. So from your point of view, what were the kind of main symptoms that were really really kind of setting
Yeah.
you off and you really struggled with.
Yeah. I would say though, is just to kind of pick up on that, I do think that getting COVID was a triggering event,
Yeah.
for sure. But if I look back, I had brain fog before I got COVID. I
Mm.
just didn't really attach much meaning to it. I would just be like, oh, I feel a bit sleepy today. Oh, I feel a bit foggy. It's because I haven't quite woken up yet. So I just didn't attach any kind of significant meaning. I didn't attach fear to it. I didn't attach worry to it. And I have seen a lot of people that when they talk about long COVID and they talk about being triggered, if they go back, they do start to say that actually they already had some mind body symptoms. They maybe just didn't really notice them or attach as much meaning to them. So that's quite interesting. But in terms of symptoms, blistered toes that scared me more than anything else. And I think they scared me because I wasn't expecting them, and I looked, and I literally had blisters and purple toes. And then I googled, and it said it was called the COVID toe.
I remember that. I remember about that actually.
Yeah. So that freaked me out.
That's horrifying.
Yeah, pins and needles, which is horrible, isn't it? Because then you feel like it's literally your nerves. And remember that this is SARS-CoV-2, isn't it? And
Yeah.
so I remember SARS being in the news, and that was all about it affects your nervous system. And so there's a real fear around anything that potentially affects your nervous system. I had a burning back, and I listened to some podcast that called it lactic acidosis or something. So that completely freaked me out. It was quite a signature throughout. Every time I went into a kind of bust, it was there. My throat was really tight, shortness of breath. At one point, I mean, it's physical because at one point I looked in the mirror and I was grey.
Mm.
My chest was so tight, and I can't remember. I googled about that, and I can't remember the name that they called it. It begins with C. It will come
I
to
can
me. I'll
imagine
put it in the show
I can imagine
notes.
what you mean though.
I can't think, but I've googled it, and then you're like, oh my god, it's a thing, and then
Yeah.
it becomes a thing, and then insomnia. That I think was probably the hardest thing. I convinced myself I was never going to sleep again. Um, and of course, that makes it worse because then every time it gets to night time, you're thinking about, will this be the night that I sleep a bit or I don't sleep a
Mm.
bit? And that went on for months.
Yeah. And in
Yeah.
terms of, did that derealization and the brain fog, did that continue? And did you also have elements of post-exertional malaise or mental exertional malaise? Was that ever a feature of your symptoms as well?
Yeah. So I remember I did the GUPTA program, which I guess we'll talk about. And then afterwards, I was like, right, I'm going to get back on my bike.
Yes.
And if I look back now, I intended to do 10 minutes on the flats and I did 15 on the flats. And so I was a bit annoyed with myself because I'd done more, even though actually my heart rate was no more than 60 heartbeats a minute. And afterwards, I thought, oh, I've got away with it. I've got away with it. And then I crashed that night.
Mm.
And I thought, right, that's it. That's because I got on my bike. So, yeah. And what was quite interesting is every time I tried to work, I would get symptoms. And every time I cancelled work, I would feel a bit better. And
Mm.
that was quite consistent. And one day, actually, I rang my mum and I just made the decision to cancel work for 5 weeks. I had all these different courses that I'd booked in. I'd cancelled the whole lot. And I said, Mum, maybe I've made a mistake because as soon as I did it, I felt better. Maybe I should go back. And we both just stopped and went, that's really significant. That isn't a coincidence. This is the fourth time that you've said that because I was kind of cancelling for a week, going back to work, cancelling for a week, going back. And every time it got closer to a work piece, I'd start to get symptoms.
It kind of manifests then almost as you're nearing that time and you started to develop the symptoms maybe as a result of that kind of stress and kind of fear response, as though you're as you're approaching that time? Is that what
Yeah.
you think that you would attribute that to?
At the time, I just went, it's something to do with stress, something to do with stress. And then I listened to the Gupta explanation where he talked about um, a virus being a triggering point to already stressed out system, and then your nervous system goes into dysregulation, producing symptoms, and then you get into this loop where you're so worried that you create more symptoms, and then the fear of the symptoms create more symptoms. And so that made sense. And then I listened to a podcast by Nicole Sachs, and I remember sitting in the grass in my garden and just having this epiphany moment. And the podcast was called Pre-Grieving. And she
Hmm.
basically said that, and she was talking about chronic pain, but actually chronic pain, chronic fatigue, same thing in terms of this kind of thing. And it was about the fact that if you're worrying about an event coming up and you're starting to get symptoms, it's not the event, it's the worry about the event and the worry
Mm.
about will I be okay. And I see it so much in long COVID groups now where people are like, 2 days before I was about to start work, I crashed. It's obviously too much, or I'm worrying about this wedding, or I was about to go on holiday and, now I've got symptoms. What do I do? And you start to realize this could be the case for a lot of people in terms of just this pre-grieving, this pre-worrying, the overwhelm, really, the what
Hmm.
ifs, the what if I'm not going to be well enough, the what if I can't perform, the what if this happens. It's exhausting.
Hmm. And it sets things off, kind of. Yeah, it's quite interesting because I remember seeing some. I think it was maybe Ray Nagel talking about. She went through a period, and quite a few people have been through this, where there's this kind of thought process that, right, in order for me to allow myself to fully recover, I need to sit in a completely isolated environment. I need to, be away in the middle of nowhere, no external stressors, nothing along those kind of lines. I need to be in the perfect, optimal environment with nothing that could trigger me, nothing could set me off. And yet, they often talk about how even in those situations, they don't necessarily actually solve everything, and it doesn't necessarily make the symptoms go away, because you can't live in this kind of like isolated little bubble. And like you said, then there's certainly something, I think, in how you react to the expectation of certain things, and that's why, like you said, these kind of external stresses about expecting things that are coming up. And I would notice that before doing certain exercise, for example, or certain stressful events coming up, that would be potentially a trigger in certain
Yeah.
certain instances. And I think it's naive to assume that there's no correlation between the reaction of your like nervous system and your your body's bodily reaction to these things, and that there's no impact on the symptoms. I mean, we see that with chronic pain. We see that with chronic
Yeah.
pain. There's a huge correlation between how, when people are about to do certain things, or there's emotional situations, that really sets that stuff off as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think I saw a lecture the other day, and he was talking about alarms basically. And he said, if you think prehistorically, we need these alarms. So if you break your ankle, for instance, and you then try and walk on it, you're going to get pain because it's not a good idea because you're going to make it worse. But he says, unfortunately, 4 months later, if you are still getting pain, that's not to do with the
Yeah.
broken bone. That's your brain has memory, and it's these
Hmm.
false alarms. And it's better to have a false alarm rather than not have an alarm when you need the alarm.
Yes. Yeah.
And from an evolutionary point of view, if there is even a chance that there could possibly be a tiger
Hmm.
somewhere, it's better for your brain to give you more alarms than it needs just in case.
Yeah. That's
And I found that quite helpful to understand. And hence, there can be a physical trigger, but that doesn't mean what kind of got you into the place doesn't necessarily give you the solution in terms of getting back out.
That's interesting, because I spoke to a neuroscientist recently talking about this, and he was saying how your brain essentially is a kind of machine learning mechanism, and it's just taking in these inputs and learning and being like, okay, well, this means this, and then it kind of triggers off the rest of your body. And he's saying how, if I say I'm going to give you some stitches, this is going to be agony. Guess what? You
Yep.
probably will feel that. And if vice versa, you say this is going to be fine. Guess what? Your brain, because it's just taking in information and distributing it accordingly. And I think it's a very powerful thing. I mean, I think when we discovered the placebo effect, right? It was a doctor in the armed forces back in one of the wars, and rather than, when he ran out of morphine, instead of replacing it, he simply didn't have any. So he took saline, he just took salt water, and he started putting it into his patients. And he'd be sitting there sawing their legs and things like that, and they'd be fine. And
Amazing, isn't it?
again, it shows the power of that kind of preset of expectation of what the brain
Yeah.
can
And
do.
it's so funny because people are quite happy to believe that that story about somebody else, and they'll buy into that. But when you then kind of approach people that are experiencing something for themselves, that subjectivity of how we experience things kind of overrides our ability to realize that that could be happening to us, because there is no difference between reality and what our brain things. Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean? So pain is pain, regardless of whether it's something that our brain has imagined or whether it's an actual injury. The
yeah,
pain's the same. That's the
yeah.
power of the placebo or nocebo.
Because like the like yeah, there's that subjectivity, isn't it? Because the like pain, for example, that is felt by those who are, or not felt by those with the morphine, the action that would cause the pain is there, but the thing that causes the pain is obviously the brain's reception of that, and how that is triggered. But yeah, it's a very interesting point. So I'd like to go back to you're obviously having this barrage of symptoms, right? You're struggling with your brain fog, derealization, fatigue, all of these symptoms. What happened then, and how did you get yourself? What were some of the big things that moved you forward? Because so many people watching this will be feeling stuck and
Yeah.
feeling without hope. And what do I do now? And where can I look for help? What helped you?
Yeah. I mean, there's some key defining moments. One actually was the fact that I had read, I can't remember who plays Superman now. You'll know, Christopher Reeve's biography, how he broke his neck and then his journey in terms of acceptance and looking at the things that he could still do. And he still directed films and he still acted in films, even though he was paralyzed from the neck downwards, and just kind of realizing that it wasn't, life wasn't as bad for me, and that, that absolute determination and the looking for what was working and what I could do, was going to be key. And just generally realizing that my mindset, um, was going to be key in terms of how I viewed this entire situation. So I think that was key. I happened to have a few friends. I put a thing out on Facebook and asked people about their experiences of anything post viral or fatigue. And I got a few friends that came back that talked about having various fatigue things in their teenage years and getting better. I had someone that had done the graded exercise trial and had got better. Someone else that had been diagnosed with ME and got better, and then two people that had had long COVID and were getting better. And I think that exposure to people that were further along and that realization that you could get better, and that it was something that people could recover from, I think was key. I had already worked out that there was a component of stress, so that was definitely key. And I'd worked out also that, I had some influence over, I could feel some initial tiredness, some initial anxiety, some initial symptoms, and that didn't have to predetermine how far into the crash I went.
Hmm.
I'd started to realize that I had influence if I could stop, if I could meditate, if I could practice breathing. Then I hadn't really worked it out completely. I just knew that I had some influence, and some of these early signs didn't have to predict a full-on crash, and that my response to stress and how calm I was, I'd started to work out that that had an impact. The Gupta explanation I thought was fantastic around the nervous system. And I'd happened to listen to Nicole Sachs playing a podcast called The Symptom Imperative, where she said, why is it that people get symptoms that vary? Why are there hundreds of symptoms? Why do people's symptoms, change both in terms of intensity, but also in terms of where they are throughout their journey? And she said the only explanation is the nervous system. And I think because I'd heard these things from so many different places, the only thing that made sense was that I was clearly in some chronic state of fight or flight. And so everything was about, it hadn't totally worked it out, but everything was about, how do I get out of this fight or flight mode? What things can I do to manage my stress to start to calm myself down?
Because I guess
So that
you'd
was
found
definitely key.
then that you'd found that you'd been able to kind of dampen these crashes and dampen this stress response when you became aware and when you put in measures into place that kind of helped you to settle and sort of calm down your system, I guess. Is that what you were kind of talking about when you're doing this meditation and breath work? Once you kind of got the signs that, okay, am I maybe, looking at a kind of crashing here?
Yeah, and I don't think I'd worked it out. I mean, it was a journey. This is in 2020. There isn't as much information as there is now. I hadn't fully worked it out. I was still on that journey. It was trying to piece together what was happening. But I hadn't really worked out the mechanics of it all, but I certainly worked out that, for example, I did a 10-minute walk, and I actually went to 11 minutes, and afterwards I got symptoms, and I just sat really quietly listening to a meditation. And then I watched a film that I'd wanted to watch. And when it was over, I realized that the sensations had gone. So I'd started to realize that there was some influence. I just hadn't really worked out exactly the mechanics to it all.
That's I that reminds me of an exercise that I often do. It's called somatic tracking, and it's
Yeah.
something that's utilized in pain reprocessing therapy, where you simply you meditate and you watch the kind of sensations that you're feeling, whether it be like brain fog or a pain somewhere, and you focus your attention on those areas. So whether if it's in the brain, then you can focus it on there. It's a kind of vipassana meditation, but focus on a specific area.
Yeah.
And in doing that, you don't watch it like a hawk, but you watch it kind of with a light curiosity.
Yeah.
And you notice that after 5, 10, 15 minutes of just constantly keeping your attention there, when it drifts, you bring it back, you notice that it almost kind of disperses a little
Yeah.
bit. And it's really interesting. I found doing that exercise as one of the key things that helped me move away from thinking any of this like mind body stuff is bullshit, like,
Yeah.
because I could see it in my own eyes. And I urge anybody to try it as well, simply just to sit there and to watch those sensations and see how they change and how they evolve as you watch them.
Yeah, and I think what you're doing there is that you're changing the meaning, aren't you? Because then you're not trying to fight these sensations or get rid of them or run away from them, which is impossible. You're just sitting with them.
Yeah.
That's it, isn't it? And if you're kind of going, do you know what? You can come with me if you want. I'm still going to go and take a walk, but you can come if you want, or you can stay, or you can do what you want. And you're not attaching meaning, you're not attaching catastrophe or disaster, you're just watching them
Hmm.
and not responding to them, then I think that's key, isn't it? And
Hmm.
once you stop kind of fearing them, they sort of lose their hold.
Yeah.
If you notice them and you wonder what color they are, or you kind of observe them really closely, or notice them kind of move, it sort of loses its hold. And once it loses its hold,
Yeah.
they start to just disappear. They start to not kind of control how you live your life.
So you'd had this kind of experience with noticing the meditation and this ability to kind of dampen the responses that you were having. then so that got you to a better place, right? That got you to being a little bit more managing. And then how did you transition to what was the process from there, and some of the key realizations and
Yeah.
key things that helped, that got you from that position to the point that you're at now, running marathons and doing all sorts of all
Yeah,
sorts of stuff.
no. Do you know what? I walked for about 5 miles in the middle of the London Marathon. But it's all right, isn't it?
That's
It's a
fine.
little
That's fine.
running.
We'll let you off. We'll let you
Yeah.
off this
Do,
time.
do you know what, Harry? There's a couple of things that I didn't realise at the time, but I've kind of since kind of realised. One is, um, well, what one I realised was that I made a decision to enjoy my time off. I took some time off. I'd never had that time before. I made a decision to enjoy it, and that it was just going to be a phase. And I think that was really key. I imagined that I was just kind of on holiday in my garden, and that I took the pressure off because everyone else was taking my daughter to school and I didn't have to work for that time. So I think I made the decision to enjoy it, and that it was going to be just a phase. And I think that's key. And I think the other thing is that I didn't try too hard. So I did meditate, and I did read mind body stuff, and I did kind of read books on beliefs, and I did do some of the kind of brain stop type activities, but I didn't do it all day.
You didn't
You
do it
know,
obsessively.
I didn't do it obsessively. So I kind of created this routine where I'd seen a breathing physio, and she said, "You're hyperventilating, your breathing is completely out of kilter." I didn't realize it at the time, but actually, that's all linked to a fear response. I just hadn't really clocked, but I had started doing some breathing, and then I created this daily plan basically, where I would get up every day to get my daughter dressed. Didn't have a choice there, but actually I think that helped me. I take my supplements that I think probably didn't help, but I did it anyway. I'd have a smoothie. I'd send my daughter to school. I'd sit in my garden. I might do a meditation, and then just read and
Mm,
kind of just enjoyed life. I might do a meditation in the evening. I might listen to something about beliefs or nervous system, but not all day.
mm.
And I kind of look back and I kind of cherish that time actually, because I probably won't have that time again. Never had that time before. And so it was acceptance, but it wasn't resignation. It was acceptance that this was a phase. And I wasn't obsessive. I didn't do all of these techniques all of the time. And I did them with curiosity.
Hmm.
And I spoke to Nicole Sachs, and she said actually that was probably a massive saving grace, because you get people mailing you going, "I've tried it all, it's not working," and you realise that they've literally done every program going. They're spending all their time getting overwhelmed with how much they have to do to recover. And I think I didn't do that. I let go.
You had it as a bit more, yeah. So just to give the listeners a little idea of what you're talking about when you talk about these techniques, and I know you mentioned the stop and things like that. Could you give us a quick overview of what is meant by these techniques when it comes to the stop, and then I'd love to dive actually back into the
Yeah.
approach and how you did it with like this curiosity.
Sure. So, I mean, I think it comes originally from some NLP techniques. Probably the lightning process was probably the first stop, but there's various different brain retraining programs, and all of them seem to have an element of noticing your worried thoughts. Which might be, what if I never recover? What if it gets worse? What if I'm permanently damaged? What if the virus has caused, me to completely ruin my life? What if it was man-made? You get the idea. And just kind of noticing these thoughts. And you don't have to say stop. You could say, chill out, Rachel. How do I know that's really true? You can change it around, or I did anyway, because I've never been completely conventional. But something to kind of tell yourself that actually you don't need to go down this catastrophic route. And quite often, these processes also have an element of maybe visualizing a different pathway, or telling yourself that there's a different pathway, or some kind of affirmation to yourself that actually you're doing okay and you are getting better, and there's lots of things that you can do, and you don't have to go down this what if,
Hmm.
path.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's it's like the technique that's used with that chronic pain reprocessing therapy, right? Isn't it? So
Is it
it's
the same
the
or similar?
noticing, yeah, like noticing those symptoms and or those sensations that arise, and then this kind of visualization and creating a kind of alternative sensation when you're doing that. But I think it's really interesting when you say about this kind of the way you kind of talk about it with this curiosity, and because I am very much the kind of person I want to do things. I'll do this and I'll do it like 100%. And I whenever I've gone through periods, certainly at the beginning, whenever I was using these kind of techniques, I was like, right, every time, and I'm going to do it. And fuck, I didn't do it that right this time. Like, I didn't, I missed it that time. I didn't do it. And then that kind of generated even more just
Yeah,
frustration and more stress. And it really didn't, it really, I found that almost generating more problems
yeah,
than it was solving. And I think a lot of people come into this where they're obsessing over
yeah,
doing this correctly, whether it be their meditation and doing all of their recovery stuff correctly. And I think it's really, really important. You've mentioned it. I spoke to Kyle, who mentioned this as well, about doing these things and these mind body, the meditations and all of your recovery stuff, whatever you do around improving your trying to get better, with a touch of curiosity and acceptance,
yeah.
and not this obsessive nature that is demanding of yourself that you're doing it all the time. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm on a group that we've set up. It's just a messenger group of people that were almost better, and I just thought they need something else. And we just chat. It's a group of women, and you start to notice that they're like, "I'm having this sensation. Right, I must be doing this particular technique. I can't be doing it right." And you're like, "How are you actually thinking about yourself? Are you doing this through frustration or love?
Mm,
How are you actually being?" And one of the best techniques that I've found is actually not a technique at all. And it is literally to kind of notice thoughts, realize that if you just notice them and don't do anything, they'll go and new ones will be replaced.
mm,
And actually, just that power of observing, maybe being curious. But if you're doing a technique that's not working and you're getting more and more frustrated with yourself as to why it's not working, frustration is just a cousin of fear.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's the same. It's a negative emotion.
So you kept at with these techniques, and I think I remember you saying last time this, you kind of started to notice then that you were having less and less reactions to different things. Were you also doing things like removing like caffeine and doing stuff to try and keep your system kind of balanced? With other stuff that you were doing, or was this largely a kind of process of gradually becoming more and more at ease with whatever came up, and then over time you started to notice that you were feeling better?
um, I think what's interesting actually is I started to realise that I could walk in the house, and actually I could do up to 7,000 steps in the house.
Hmm.
But if I walked outside where I was measuring, then I couldn't do more than 10 minutes. I started to notice some discrepancies between what I was watching and monitoring and what I wasn't monitoring. So that's quite interesting. But I decided to strip everything back and just rest. And I think that's because someone told me that the only way of getting better was to completely rest in a dark room. And then luckily, someone told me that actually fatigue can breed fatigue. And if you're sleeping too much, it creates as many problems as not sleeping enough because it kicks out your circadian rhythm. And so I think I was just very lucky with what I was kind of exposed to at what points, because I realized that getting up and seeing sunlight and being outside were really important. And then I now don't think that I needed to rest in the way that I thought. I think it was an opportunity to de stress, to take some time out, to give myself time to slow down, to think, to be kind to myself, to be compassionate. And then I decided that I was going to rebuild my life. I was lucky. I'd met someone who had done a graded exercise program, the controversial one, and she'd got better. And she said that basically like every week she was encouraged to just walk a bit further, and actually that had really helped. And so I just kind of went, okay, well, I'm going to firstly get a bit of independence. I'm going to walk to the shop. And then I felt really good because at least I could be independent and walk to the shop.
Yeah.
Then I decided that I needed to go back to work. And that was a really defining moment because I had this 2-hour webinar that I was doing. I remember it at the end of March. I'd taken the whole of March off. 2 days before the webinar, lo and behold, I have a bit of a crash.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you believe it? And then I was okay the next day, and then I didn't sleep. And I got myself into complete state. I remember ringing my mum and going, "Mum, I think I need to take 6 months off. This is ridiculous. This has made me worse." And she said, "Well, it's a bit too late for this 2 hours. You're going to have to do it because you've got people that have paid." So I did the course, 2 hours. It was something I knew so well I could do it without really even being there. And then afterwards, actually, I felt a bit better. And I think that was the defining moment, that I'd almost felt the fear and I'd done it anyway.
Yeah.
And speaking to Nicole Sachs, she says sometimes people in absolute desperation do things, and the fear of doing something is worse than the doing it. And so if you can persuade yourself that you're safe to do something, you're not going to make it even worse, even if you get symptoms, it'll be all right. That's just your kind of nervous system. Then you can start to put things back in. And for me, that was the making of me, because it's my identity. Being able to work, it's what, when people say, "What do you do?" it's the first thing that you answer, right? So for me, that was an absolute defining moment, that I could be in the worst crash, I could still log on, I could do it, and I didn't make myself worse. I actually felt a bit better afterwards. I mean, that's huge.
And you started to learn almost. You gain that sense of confidence, and then that almost an element of trust back in your body, because I think a lot of
Yeah.
people lose that. I think you lose that kind of like, you're like, fuck, my body just can't tolerate this. It can't do things anymore. And I guess that must be, yeah, super empowering to have that kind of belief and trust back into your body. It's like when you figure that you can do some stuff, it's like, oh wow.
Yeah, but it's a massive leap of faith. And honestly, Harry, it could have gone the other way. I could have taken 6 months. And I wonder what would have happened then, because then if I'd have taken 8 months off and then tried to go back to a performance type job where, there's quite a lot of stress, as there is with a lot of jobs, I wonder whether I could have even done that. I don't know. That's the problem, is that people get into a state of, I need to be able to heal first and then work. And you're like, well, actually, when you then try and increase, there's going to be some fear, and fear produces symptoms. So actually, if you can start to introduce things slowly into your life, that can actually create the healing. It's a paradigm shift.
Because you can't, like we said, I mean, it depends on. I think it depends on where you're at with with how bad you are in how you're feeling. But I think it goes back to that point I made earlier, where I think it's very often and easy to assume that I need to just be in total isolation and total removal of anything stress, and then I will eventually, come to recovery. And I think a lot of people who have recovered, I've spoken to, seem to say that's not the case. And obviously you don't want to be stupid and just doing tons and tons of stuff, but there's an element of needing to be involved in life to a degree and incrementally increase what you were doing. And I think this assuming that a total being in total isolation will be the thing that and will make you totally better, and I think that's often not. It's a bit of a fallacy, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think again it goes back to, are you doing it with love or fear? Because if you're isolating out of fear of the fact that if you do anything it could create symptoms,
Yeah.
well, that's not life, is it?
Yeah.
In the end, stress isn't even bad. It's how we react to stressful situations, and our bodies are designed to cope with stress, just not chronic stress. And fluctuate between the two sides of the nervous system. And in order to get well, You can't just stay in bed and hope that you'll get well. There's a behavioural element. I mean, I've seen a lot of research now, and actually, even more than the brain retraining, I think is that behavioural element. And if you can convince yourself you're safe and start to increase and disengage from being ill and start to see yourself as someone that's, healing in the same way that if you break a leg, you slowly start to do more and more, and you recuperate. If you can see yourself in the same way, I think that's how you start to recover. I mean, who wants to live with it
Yeah, it's
when
it's a
recovery is
miserable.
possible?
It is miserable for sure. Amazing. I would love to just to finish up. I'd love to touch on what you've been doing for the last couple of years since recovering, because we spoke about this before. I think there's a lot of people who get incredibly inspired when they see recovery stories. I know I certainly do, and I love to hear about people who've recovered. I love to hear about what they've been up to as well, and also, especially in cases like yourself, to see that it's not necessarily just remission, because you've
Yeah,
been better for best part of what, 1-2 years now, two maybe even more than that.
maybe.
Yeah, and I would love to hear what you've been up to, going over some of the kind of activities that you've been up to as well, just to give the viewers a little bit of inspiration.
Yeah, I did actually have about 6 months after recovery. I woke up one day. I'd had quite a stressful period and I wasn't really reacting very well to that stress. So I woke up one day and I had brain fog. I think I'd been on a lot of long COVID groups and I'd been arguing with people about mind body. And then the next day I had brain fog. And then the day after that, and I did have what I call a wobble,
Hmm.
where I started to question and I started to doubt and I started to kind of think, is it happening again? And then I kind of spoke to my lightning process coach. I read a book by Nicola Bird about anxiety, and I realized that just an insignificant piece of brain fog, probably because I'd slept a bit too long, or maybe I was stressed, I don't know. I'd attached such meaning to it that I was looking for it. I was waking up worrying about it. And I just got myself back into a cycle. And I've spoken to so many people where this has happened, where they've recovered, but there's still a tiny bit of doubt or a tiny bit of health anxiety. And I almost think that it's almost a necessary part of recovery is to have a wobble.
Mm.
There's obviously something that you haven't quite kind of worked out for yourself in terms of why it's happening or some kind of belief. But I haven't had one since. I think that was the final kind of piece for me,
Hmm.
and really getting to grips with the fact that actually I think I've lived in fear for a long time. I think I was a worrier for a long time. And I don't think I realized. And so it's kind of that was the piece that led me to actually go back and do bit more work on myself and my reactions to things and how I manage stress and what I worried about and what I chilled out about, and just some of my kind of personality traits that work for me most of the time but don't always. So that was really good actually, and I'm really glad that happened. And I blog about that. I call it "It's Not All About COVID." I don't think that was anything to do with COVID. I think that was about fear of having had it
Hmm.
and just
Hmm.
almost a PTSD kind of response. So that happened. I had COVID again, and my dad, who is has had cancer, so he was shielding. He got COVID a couple of weeks before and was well within a week. And so when I got COVID again, and I'd been so frightened to get it that every time I thought I had it, I'd get symptoms.
Yeah.
Funny that. But when I got it, I just told myself, do you know what? I've had many viruses over my 50 years in existence. This is just another virus. Many other people are getting it and recovering. Why would I be any different? I know what this is. I'm not the same person. I've done a lot of work. And I did have one day with loads of fatigue. And I remember ringing my mum and just going, oh no. And she's like, Rachel, come on. You know what this is. Yes, there might be some fatigue from the virus. Most of it's the meaning you're putting on it. I can hear you. I can see what you're doing. You're in this spiral. Next day, I decided to go skiing. I was fine. I went back to work the next week. I was fine. And I think that was the final piece for me almost. I got out of a toxic relationship as well, so that could have also been something to do with it. That was the final piece. I then knew that I wasn't really scared of it anymore, and I
Hmm.
knew that that if I worried about something, I could potentially get myself in a spiral. But actually, I had enough evidence that I didn't need to do that anymore. Um, yeah, I still get the odd anxiety, but now when I notice the feelings, I just kind of do what you say, the somatic tracking, just observe them, know that new feelings will come along. Nothing's really changed. It's just
Hmm.
feelings.
That confidence,
um,
I guess. You have that kind of confidence
I
and
think so. I've been following a lady called Chana Studley, and she talks about the three principles, and it's all just a different way of thinking. And when you have these kind of worried thoughts, just not having to do anything, not having to do a technique, just going, oh, there's a worried thought.
hmm.
Oh, there'll be another one in a minute. I'm just going to get on with my life, and not take too much worry of them. And then, tomorrow's another day. And I think that's been really helpful. Um, she has some views on menopause, actually, if anyone's interested. It's for another day, but a book called Very Well. And again, it's a lot about meaning, social kind of contagion, placebo, nocebo, worth worth doing. For about a year afterwards, I realised that if I got really tired, and I've done a marathon, so I'm clearly fine in terms of energy, but I did notice that I'd get quite triggered if I was really tired. I could
Hmm.
feel that I would start to kind of latch onto that feeling of being tired. So I've really had to work on that tiredness is normal. Everyone has off days, and that's
Hmm.
normal. That's just being human. Everyone has mind and body symptoms. My daughter gets tummy aches when she's got her SATs this week.
Yeah.
It's normal to have some sensations.
I guess
Um,
it's unlearning as well. The kind of
yeah,
if for so long you had those symptoms and indicate a kind of crash or the malaise or whatever it is, I guess once you had got to the point where you're now better, there was also still an element of that concern and sort of fear because you were like, oh, for so long, like you said,
yeah.
our brains are constantly learning, and if for so long that had been indicative of a certain crash or something like that, then now you were getting to the point where you were having to kind of relearn that,
Yeah,
if that makes
absolutely.
sense.
My lightning process coach talks about it being like a pony that goes the same route to take the kids around the route, and the pony wants to go the way the pony wants to go because that's the way it's learned to go.
Hmm.
And actually, that's what our brains do. They take the easy path, they take the unconscious path because most of the time it actually pays. But when it comes to chronic illness, it's about how do you become vigilant in terms of your thoughts and not buying into
Hmm.
keeping turning your pony the other way until it kind of learns. So I thought that was quite good. I've joined a group called Coffee as a kind of recovered patient. There's a group of us that are essentially asking scientists questions about their research and giving our experience. So that's really helpful. And we host seminars around kind of mind body, particularly. So I'll let you know in terms of that. Interestingly, my daughter's just been diagnosed with autism and we're doing therapy at the moment. There's a massive crossover around thinking patterns, dealing with emotions, nervous system regulation, and all the things that she's learning in therapy. Wait for it, breathing techniques,
Hmm.
managing emotions, understanding what you respond to, coping with stress, understanding what we like, what we don't like, learning to kind of meditate, learning what works for us, what don't. So that's been kind of really interesting. And actually, my experience with long COVID has helped me make a massive difference in terms of then her journey and reducing the anxiety for her and physical symptoms that were kind of attached to that. So that's been really interesting as well.
That's
It
amazing to
all
have that benefit.
connects.
Yeah, that you can hand down and pass over. I think for many people going through kind of these experiences is life changing in terms of the learnings that you pick up from it, and yeah, in many ways, I think you hear a lot of people who recover and then they say, it was horrific, but the learnings and what I got out of it long term has been really life changing. I would
Yeah.
love to. just to wrap things up and to finish off, because I've had it's been wonderful to catch up with you again, Rachel. It's been really, really, really good. I would love for you to leave our viewers with a kind of final message, a message of hope, a message of advice, and something that they can take away from this conversation.
Ooh, do you know what? I was listening to an interview with Liz Carlson the other day, and she was talking about her recovery story. I think she does a website called Heal with Liz, and various interviews of people that recovered. And she said that there was a point where she just suddenly went, "I'm well, I'm well." And it was similar to my journey where I suddenly went, what if I'm well? What if I'm actually well, but I'm keeping myself stuck? How would that change everything? And that was like being told that the world was round rather than flat. Right. And so I would say to people, consider the fact that you might already be well, but you're actually kind of keeping yourself dysregulated through the worries and beliefs that you might be ill, rather than thinking that you're ill and you need to heal. And it's a shift, and it might be too big a shift for some people. But actually, if you can start to make that shift, or at least be curious about what if it was true, then for me, that kind of changed everything, actually, because then I was like, okay, I'm just human, but I'm essentially well. I then didn't need to search for this kind of golden recovery, because it was like, I'm already well. I'm human. I have good days and bad days, and it's a journey, and I can be curious about that journey, and everything's a learning. But essentially, I start from a place of I'm not broken.
Mm.
There's actually
It's
nothing to fix other than just learning to love myself more and do more things that help me and less things that don't. So I would say that, and I would say get off the long COVID groups.
mm.
Get off the long COVID groups, because otherwise there's fear and there's victim mentality, and it will drag you down.
Yeah, I think they're definitely, yeah, there's definitely a lot of negativity. I think yeah, it's a struggle, and there's constant perpetual. And like you said, if one of the key things, and one of the things that is very could be very helpful, is to, like you said, often we do all these tests and there isn't necessarily seem like there's anything wrong with the hardware in a lot of cases, and like you say, it's a case of trying to become more detached and more regulate that nervous system again and become in a more calm state. Anything that is going to kind of perpetuate that, whether it be the Facebook groups and being triggered, I think is not a good not a good thing. But
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a
Rachel,
couple of ones. Nicole Sachs' Facebook group, actually, I think is really helpful, because there's lots of people
yeah,
that have recovered. So there are a couple of ones where that's good in community, but there's a lot out there with a
yeah,
lot
yeah,
of
yeah.
false beliefs. Um,
Positive stories, I think, is
and positive
the way to
stories,
go.
recovery stories, and
Yeah.
actually looking for the bits that you can apply to yourself.
Hmm. Amazing, Rachel. Thank you so much for coming back. It's always a pleasure to speak. And yeah, any links that you mentioned in the podcast, I'll put them in the comments below. Hope that everybody enjoyed. Hope that was useful. And yeah, Rachel, thank you again.
You're very welcome.